I still hear the sink, the way it sputtered when the faucet first came on, the sleepy groan of old pipes carrying the day's first cold water. Mark cupped his hands and dashed a shock of it against his face like he did before every early flight, and the droplets pattered on our tiled floor like tiny drum beats counting down to departure. We were a two-person orchestra in the pre-dawn, my whispering, "You're going to miss your coffee," his reply of, "I'll get one at the airport," the soft thunk of his suitcase wheels over the threshold, the hush of a neighborhood not yet awake. You don't realize how sacred ordinary noises are until they're gone. He was bound for Atlanta on a Delta Connection morning hop, Comair Flight 5191. A commuter plane, a quick start to a long business day. He was bringing a portfolio with hand-drawn arrows and patient notes because he never trusted digital alone. "Paper is real," he used to say, wagging his pen. "Paper gets there even when Wi-Fi doesn't." I teased him for being old school, but secretly I loved that about him, the way he resisted becoming purely virtual, the way he insisted on being tangible. The air was wet and warm that morning. August in Kentucky keeps the night's breath even when the sky is violet with first light. He kissed me twice, a quick peck, and then one more like a postscript, and he said something that didn't sound like a last sentence. "Text me when you wake up." Then he was rolling that suitcase toward the door, and I was fixing the collar of his shirt because it folded in on itself. The small things you do with your hands before you have to empty them. We lived 15 minutes from Bluegrass Airport. He liked to get there early, to sit at the gate with people who were also awake for reasons that mattered. Soldiers with duffels, nurses headed to conferences, grandparents wearing sweatshirts that announced their role. He always texted me something about the fellow travelers. "Lady with the derby hat again," or "Guy 2 seats over is already asleep." When the taxi app pinged that the car had arrived, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Back by dinner." It was nothing extraordinary. That was the point. I watched the taillights until they turned out of our street. The house swallowed the sound. I made his coffee anyway, out of habit, a lonely gesture, then left it cooling by the window, thinking he'd drink it in the story I'd tell him later about how I still made it. The dawn lifted like a curtain, but the room stayed dim, a stage that hadn't yet found its spotlight. I crawled back into bed, my phone face down on the nightstand, Mark's side still warm. The call didn't come for a while. In between, there were ordinary hours, the whir of the air conditioner, the dog adjusting on the rug, the calendar notification reminding me to pay the gas bill. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't Mark. It was a number with a Lexington prefix, unknown. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. I answered with that bright fake hello we put on for strangers. The woman said my name the way people do when they are reading from a list, but trying to soften it with their voice. "Is this Mrs. Carter?" "Yes." "Ma'am, I'm calling regarding Comair Flight 5191. "Yes?" "There has been an accident." I have tried to remember what I said next, and there is only an emptiness, an erased chalkboard. People talk about time slowing down, but mine didn't. Mine fell. It fell like a dropped plate that doesn't shatter at first. It bounces, disbelieving, and then it breaks. I couldn't make the words join, couldn't make them consent to sense. Accident meant flat tire, delay, reroute. Accident meant inconvenience. But the woman kept speaking very carefully, the way you speak when the syllables are fragile. She said runway and off the end and fire. She said, "There is limited information and we are assembling families at the airport." She said, "Please come." I stood up too fast and the room tilted. The dog lifted his head, puzzled. In the mirror, a woman I knew well had changed in some minute way, like a picture after dust has been blown from it. I grabbed the first clothes at hand, couldn't find my keys, found them in the freezer where I had placed the ice tray last night. Half a world of carefulness shrank to a single list. Keys, phone, purse, door. The coffee by the window had a skin on it. I threw it away as if that could spare me something later. Driving to Bluegrass Airport, everything was precise. The stripes on the road were perfectly aligned. The traffic lights performed their color duties with military accuracy. The radio said nothing I could hear. On the horizon, the sky had advanced from violet to a thin slate blue, and the water on the fields turned it into a mirror. I kept expecting a sign that said, "Turn back, this is the wrong story." The closer I got, the more cars appeared that weren't just cars. They were vans with insignias, sedans with men in reflective vests stepping out to talk into radios, unmarked vehicles with quiet urgency. At the terminal, they directed me not to departures, not to arrivals. A volunteer with a laminated badge used my first name as if we were friends, and her kindness had weight. "This way, Emily." She led me down a corridor that was for employees only, a place where the airport wore no makeup. The rooms we passed had stainless steel counters and whiteboards with schedules half erased. We arrived at a space that had been a conference room yesterday and a family assistance center today. There were pitchers of water and paper cups, tissues placed like offerings, a table with board games for children that no one would ever open today because how could you roll dice? They asked me to write Mark's full name on a form, his seat number if I had it. I didn't. He never cared about the window, the last 4 digits of his ID. They asked how to contact our parents and whether anyone else was traveling with him, and if he had any distinguishing features. Distinguishing features. What a curious way to remember the man you love. He had a scar on his right thumb from when he tried to fix the mower by himself. He had a cowlick that made his hair rebellious at the crown. He had a low laugh that at the end of it caught like a record getting playful with itself. A chaplain came and sat near me, not too close. He had the training of someone who knows how not to push words into spaces where they don't fit. He said, "I'm here with you. Not for you, not instead of you. With you." The prepositions mattered. He asked if I wanted to call someone, and I said, "He'll call me," as if grammar could negotiate with fate. Families filtered in, faces composed like someone else's. We looked at each other and did not look. Every television on every wall was off, as if light would be rude. Somewhere in the building, a vending machine dispensed a bag of chips with its familiar metal groan, and the sound felt obscene. I didn't know then about runway lights or headings, about checklists or sterile cockpit procedures. I didn't know the difference between runway 22 and runway 26, or that the gap between those numbers could be measured not just in degrees, but in lives. I only knew the shape of Mark's name on my tongue, and the sudden, impossible duty of keeping it safe when everything else had slipped from its hook. The room filled with careful language and the absence of information, and the hour hand on the clock refused to move. I would learn the taxi later, pieced together like a quilt from reports and broadcasts, from words that began with probable cause and ended with paperwork as heavy as a winter coat. But even then, in that windowless conference room with its purposeful tissues, I sensed the quiet, claustrophobic journey from gate to runway, how it must have felt inside that cockpit as the night thinned into a blue so faint it was almost an excuse. The pilots had been cleared for runway 22. That number sounds arbitrary unless you've ever watched a compass. 22 is just a way to say this direction, the kind of shorthand airplanes trust. I found a diagram in a packet much later, a simple drawing that looked like a child's game. 2 rectangles that almost met, one long and one short, angled like a slightly crooked V. By the time someone explained it to me, after the shock, after the identifications, after the matter-of-fact letters, I could trace the taxi with my fingertip. You leave the gate, you follow the line, you hold short where you're meant to, you line up with the one that's long enough to lift you, and you go. Except they didn't. Except it was dark and familiar and unfamiliar at once, because construction had rearranged the pathways like a town that had decided to renumber all the streets overnight. They talked, those pilots. The cockpit voice recorder kept a diary none of us asked to read. Not gossip, not crass, just the small tethering remarks people make to reassure themselves that the world is still ordinary. How many times had Mark made those same little remarks to strangers on planes? The weather, the time, the annoyance of an early wake-up. The rules say sterile cockpit. The phrase sounds so clean, so surgical. Under 10,000 feet, you stay focused. No extraneous conversation, but taxiing can feel like a hallway you walk down every day. You assume your feet will remember. You assume the building hasn't changed. A controller was on duty, just one, his back turned part of the time to deal with the paperwork that stacks like snow in the early hours. He cleared them for 22. Later, the words would be dissected, cleared for takeoff, runway 22. Said out loud, confirmed. The ritual is tighter than a dancer's bun. But rituals can't see in the dark. And what is darkness on a runway? It's not only the absence of light, it's a set of cues that mute themselves. No centerline lights on the short runway, fewer markings, a black mouth opening where the earth insists the air must stop. If you've ever tried to find your driveway on a rural road at 5 a.m., you know that sometimes familiarity itself deceives you. The trees look the same until they don't. I didn't know any of this when a man with a neon lanyard came into our room and used the first phrase that made me understand the scale. There were 49 fatalities, he said. There was a pause afterward, as if we could put the number back in the box, persuade it to be something else. There is one survivor, he added, and the room collapsed toward that single fact as if it were a candle in a cave. One. In that moment, one sounded miraculous and cruel, in equal measure. The survivor was a pilot, the first officer. People looked around the room with a new kind of hope, then a new kind of dread. My mind performed a trick it had never done before. It split. One part sat obediently in the chair, nodding at instructions. Someone will speak with each of you. There will be transportation to a hotel. There will be counselors. And the other part walked outside in broad daylight, crossed the tarmac, and found the plane where it shouldn't be. I saw it without wanting to. The furrow the fuselage carved through the grass, the fire's black handprint on the earth, the way the runway's end was not a line, but a story's brutal period. I imagined Mark in his seat, the angle of his arm, the way he always rested his left ankle over his right knee in moments of boredom, his hand steadying a paper cup on the tray table. It is a terrible thing to imagine the end of the person you love when you are still required to go on inhabiting grammar. Hours passed, or maybe they didn't. Parents arrived, spouses arrived, adult children who were suddenly everyone's child. There is an etiquette to catastrophe that no one teaches you. When to offer water, when to leave someone alone, when to say the name of the person you both refuse to let become past tense. Someone opened a notebook and asked me questions, and I answered them because answering questions is a way to stave off the moment when they hand you silence. Was he wearing his wedding ring? Yes. Any medical conditions? No. Dental records? Our dentist's name floated up through the fog. I wrote it as if it were normal to think of such things between breaths. In the days after, details would arrive like uninvited guests and then refuse to leave. Runway 26 was only 3,500 feet long, intended for smaller planes. Comair Flight 191 needed runway 22 with 7,000 feet to gather speed, to lift. The crew lined up on 26. The reason folded into a clutch of human factors: darkness, fatigue, construction, complacency, the false comfort of routine. The NTSB would call it a chain of errors. I think of it as a necklace, one bead looking harmless until you pull and the whole thing uncurls. And in the middle of it, the simplest idea, a heading check, the compass confirming the runway's orientation. Simple, ordinary, a habit, missed. I remember the taste of the sandwich they brought from the airport store, even though I didn't think I was hungry. Rye bread, turkey, mustard that fought back. It tasted like a dare. Eat to prove you still live. The chaplain told me to drink water because tears use it up. I nodded, as if my body were a project I could complete with a checklist. The sunlight outside begged the windows to be more than glass. Planes in the distance arced into the sky as if nothing terrible had happened, and some uncharitable part of me wanted the whole world to stop until we could tell it otherwise. Late morning became early afternoon. Someone said, "We will take you to the site if you wish," with the kind of care that acknowledged both possibilities, yes and no, as equally brave. I said no, not because I wanted to pretend it wasn't real, but because I knew that if I saw the ground where the fire had been, I would spend the rest of my life looking for Mark in the landscape. I wanted to keep him where he had always lived, in our kitchen with the sputtering sink, in the passenger seat humming harmonies, in the aisle of the hardware store comparing screws. The earth had already taken enough. That night, when the house was again a house and not a holding pen for grief, I sat at the table and opened Mark's laptop because I needed to feel something he had touched. The screen lit up and offered me his files as if it were any other Monday. I found his presentation. The first slide had a title he'd joked about, "Timing is Everything." I laughed then, a little wild, a little wrong. Timing is everything, on a runway, in a cockpit, at a sink at 4:45 a.m. when you decide to kiss once or twice. The file list blurred, and I placed my fingers on the keyboard like a pianist who has forgotten the song and only remembers the shape of playing. They told us about headings on the third day, when the language of accident reports had stopped feeling like a foreign tongue and started to become a dialect we could manage. A heading is a way of saying which way you're pointed, as unapologetic as north. Before you move, you confirm it. The number on the runway, the number on your instruments, the number in the voice of the person who cleared you. It's the cockpit equivalent of checking the house keys in your pocket before you close the door. A small habit, a ritual against chaos. I found myself tracing the numbers with a pen as if writing them might fix anything. 22, 26. The investigators were measured, their phrases sanded smooth by training. They were not cruel, they were precise. Precision felt like a kindness after the first hurricane days. One of them, a woman with tired eyes that suggested she had sat in rooms like this many times, explained that the runway the pilots used had no centerline lights. Even without knowing airplanes, you could feel what that meant. The path didn't glow. The morning was still mostly night. The airport was in the middle of construction. Taxiways rearranged like detours in a town where everyone assumed they still remembered the way. The map had been updated, yes, but maps are agreements. Human beings must sign them with attention. I started keeping a list of the words they used that I'd never had any reason to learn. Sterile cockpit, situational awareness, runway incursion, human factors. Human factors. It sounded like a seminar you might sit through at a conference after lunch, nodding while someone clicked through slides. But here, human factors meant the exact moment a good person slips an inch. The soft hand of fatigue on the back of your neck, the confidence earned from 1,000 uneventful taxis. The morning you talk about nothing in particular, because nothing in particular has always been harmless. Human factors was a kindness too, in its way, a reminder that people are not machines, that error is not malice. Sometimes I felt disloyal, making room for empathy. It is a strange, awkward thing to hold two truths at once, that a critical error ended the life you loved, and that the people who made that error woke up that morning wanting to do their jobs and go home. A chain unspooled, links catching links. A lone controller who could not divide himself into enough pairs of eyes, signage that asked more of memory than of sight, cockpit chatter filling a place where silence might have caught a discrepancy. I did not want to forgive anyone yet, but I did not want to turn to stone either. At home, I found evidence of Mark's gentle rituals and catalogued them as if they were exhibits that could be admitted in a court where the only judge was time. The way he used a pencil to keep the grocery list honest, scribbling and erasing. The 3 screws on the windowsill he had been meaning to match to the right bracket. The book he'd half finished about a man who builds a boat and never sails it. I folded his shirt with the rebellious collar and put it in a drawer I didn't think I'd open. The dog watched me with a gaze that suggested he knew everything and could say nothing. Friends came with casseroles, because grief has recipes. They said Mark's name out loud and let it sit in the room like music that doesn't insist. I discovered that sorrow has a rhythm. It swells when you try to cut it in half and softens when you let it unspool. Nights were the hardest. That was when my mind returned to the taxiway, to the nose of the plane, nudging into a wrongness the way a boat pushes off into a river that isn't the one it meant to join. I imagined the captain's hand on the thrust levers, the first officer's voice, the slight swerve that lined them up with 26. One turn, one habit, one heading left, unchallenged. In the quiet, I practiced the check I wished had happened. See the number painted huge on the asphalt, 26. Glance at the compass, should say roughly 220 degrees if 22. Feel the clench in your gut that says something is off. Speak it, challenge it, fix it. In my pretend cockpit, the challenge was cheerful, not accusatory, because that's how you bring people with you. Hey, does that line up to you? In the real cockpit, there was no challenge, no traction. I know this because someone kind and careful months later read me the transcript over the phone. I listened with my eyes closed, and afterward I stood at the sink and ran the water until the air felt wet enough to forgive me for still breathing. The survivor became a fact I visited and avoided. He had lived through a physics problem no one should have to solve with their body. He had to carry not just his pain, but also the weight of being the single exception. Some people were furious on my behalf and demanded I be too. I tried it on. It fit like a jacket borrowed from someone else, heavy in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves. My anger preferred inanimate objects. It burned quietly against numbers and nouns. 26, 3,500 feet, dark chatter. Now and then it flared at the faceless idea of a system that let one person watch over the field as if watching were a trivial thing. On the 7th day, I woke before the alarm and caught the exact boundary between night and morning. There is a minute, maybe less, when the world is two colors at once, the pewter of the old light and the shy blue of the new. I stood at the window and whispered the numbers again, 22, 26. It felt like a ritual I didn't choose, but couldn't refuse. Somewhere over the horizon, a plane drew a white line across the fresh sky. I followed it with my finger as if keeping it level mattered. People want meaning. I wanted plumbing. I wanted the sink to behave, the coffee to taste the same, the checklists of ordinary life to pull me through a day without asking me to narrate it. So I made a new list. Call the insurance, cancel the subscription, find the password. Each completed square didn't fix anything, but it knocked on the door of a future and said, "Open up." When I tired of typing, I opened the folder on Mark's laptop with photos, seaside snapshots and blurry concert attempts, and a whole album of me making faces while he learned to use the camera timer. The one I kept returning to was not flattering. It didn't even look like a perfect memory. It looked real. It looked like a habit we meant to keep. Later, I would go to a meeting where people talked about cross-checks and redundancy and how systems learn painfully from what goes wrong. Later, I would sit in a seat headed somewhere else and close my eyes and feel the plane accelerate and lift, and I would not mistake that for betrayal. But in those early days, the heading I needed most was smaller, toward the front door, into the grocery store, back into the world. The courage it takes to keep living beside a wrong number painted large on the ground. No one tells you that courage is a muscle you practice in line at the post office, in the act of returning a library book, in the decision to buy a plant and learn how much light it needs. I put the plant by the window where the coffee had cooled on the morning Mark left. It was nothing like runways or headings or checklists. It was stubborn, green, needy. It wanted exactly what I had left: time, attention, and a willingness to show up when nothing in particular happens. The number kept returning to me like a tide. 36 seconds. In the literature, they rounded it, shifted it by a heartbeat here or there, but that was the span that took up residence in my head, a slice of time I began to carry like a stone in my pocket. 36 seconds from the moment the thrust came up to the moment the world ran out of runway and then out of mercy. I learned it not because I was hungry for detail, but because detail felt like a handhold on a cliff face that refused to stop falling. No one gives you a script for how to absorb such numbers. They arrive so clean, so indifferent to what they measure. 36 seconds is longer than a commercial you skip, shorter than the argument you had with someone you love when you were both too tired to be kind. It's half a song. It's the time it takes to wait for your coffee to finish dripping, to find your keys, to say, "Be safe," without thinking it's the last time those words will have weight. In the early weeks, I would find myself counting under my breath while I washed dishes, running an impulsive metronome as if I could fit reality inside a rhythm and make it obey. By the time an investigator explained the takeoff roll to us in a small meeting room with fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects, I had rehearsed the scene so often it felt like remembering. The captain released the brakes. The aircraft surged forward, its engines writing their own stern music in the dark. The tires hummed over paint and then over plain asphalt, the difference subtle but real, as any runner can tell you when they leave the track for the road. In that cockpit, familiar check calls sounded, airspeed alive, power set, rituals spoken into the thin space where concentration lives. But beneath them, another rhythm, a wrongness that had no words, a runway too short for the promise being made. Someone showed us a diagram, and my finger traced the line the way children outline a path in a maze. I wanted the path to bend where it didn't, to find a way out that physics would forgive. The investigator's voice was careful. "On a properly lit runway," she said, "you see a center line of lights that shepherds you forward. On this one, runway 26, no lights in that pattern. The painted numbers help, but in darkness with the human eye adjusting and construction nearby, context can mislead." Nearby, a ballpoint pen clicked and unclicked, punctuation for a sentence no one wanted to complete. I pictured the cabin. Mark, strapped in, his seatbelt familiar as his watch band, perhaps thinking about the meeting ahead, about the joke he'd tell to make a room of strangers lean forward. I know the angle of his attention when he's waiting to be lifted. The door closing, the shuffle of carry-ons finding their final angles, the quiet moment when engines surge and the cabin collectively remembers to be reverent. He loved that part. The shove into motion, the way the floor spoke through your feet, the way strangers leaned back at once as if choreographed. 36 seconds is enough time to know you are leaving and then not. We were told about the V speeds, those small ironclad signposts in the takeoff roll that tell you when you can lift, when you must lift, and when you shouldn't even try. On runway 22, with its length, those numbers make sense on your body. On 26, they don't. They rush toward you like a deadline, and you feel the ground's refusal. The end of the runway approaches not like a finish line, but like a wall. The last part is the piece I try not to live in because imagination is a generous trait until it turns on you. In the reports, the verbs were dry: overrun, impact, post-crash fire. In my mind, they were louder but still far away, like a storm you can't stop from crossing the county line. There was a berm at the end, and there were trees that woke to the worst morning. Metal met earth, and air that was meant to be sweet with dawn filled with blackness. There are fires that seem to start with a choice. There are others that feel like an argument between elements. This was the latter. The first officer survived. That fact continued to stand in the room no matter what else we talked about, no matter how delicately we set down our cups, no matter how much we nodded at words like procedures and signage and fatigue. He survived, and I think of him sometimes not with anger, but with a bewildered tenderness. Survival is not simply breath. It is a sentence you serve with memory. He woke up carrying 36 seconds that would never stop replaying. There are mornings I hope he finds a gentler version, one where the lights are bright and the numbers match, and the heading is a comfort instead of a betrayal. In the strange, practical aftermath, I felt an urge to measure everything in my house. I stood with a tape measure extended across the kitchen, translating inches into comprehension as if I were preparing to build an ark. I timed the kettle, counted my heartbeats between streetlights on an evening walk, learned how far my breath could carry without a rest. The planes overhead were suddenly easier and harder at once. Easier because distance is a balm, harder because I knew too much about what lines, painted and imagined, were guiding them. People asked me variations of the same question. How could something so small, one turn too early, one line missed, cause something so large? I understood the generosity within the question. It is an invitation to believe that disasters are made of monsters, of big villains you can point at from the safety of your porch. But airplanes, and the humans who fly them, live in the kingdom of almost. Almost right is a different country from wrong, but their borders touch in places where dawn looks like night and memory looks like sight. The difference is a checklist, a challenge spoken aloud, a culture that makes room for the smallest doubt to be aired without fear of looking foolish. In every domain, not just aviation, we underestimate the moral weight of the sentence. Wait, does this look right to you? At the memorial service, they read 49 names, and language did what it could. Names anchor you to a world where randomness is not a god. Afterward, a man who had flown for 30 years took my hands in both of his and said, "Flying is safe because we learn from what hurts." He did not offer it as consolation so much as covenant. "We write the rules in blood," he added quietly, and then apologized for the bluntness. I told him not to. Bluntness felt like honesty in a season when euphemism would have been a second injury. I keep thinking of the cockpit, of the small, ordinary dignity of two professionals doing what they had done 1,000 times. And I want a time machine that can rewind before the throttle advances. Not to scold or punish, simply to place a finger on the glass and say, check the heading. In another life, perhaps that finger exists, and Mark is in Atlanta before lunch, telling me later that the coffee at the Lexington gate was stronger than usual, that a child in a red sweater kicked the seat and then fell asleep, that the sky over Georgia looked like a sheet being shaken out. In this life, I fold the time machine into a paper crane and practice the harder ritual, trusting that attention, shared and humble, can be a form of love we owe strangers. At night now, when I cannot sleep, I count to 36 on purpose. I make each number a little prayer for something I cannot fix retroactively. One for the controller, who carried more responsibility than a single spine should. One for the captain, who woke early intending no harm. One for the first officer, who woke late and has to keep waking. 49 for the people whose mornings vanished into the same blue I still have to live beneath. When I finish, the silence is not kinder, but it is clearer. And clarity, like the white numbers on a runway, is not mercy, but it is a direction. They called it personal effects, which sounded like a phrase you use for a coat left at a party. The woman on the phone spoke with the steady calm of someone holding a glass brimful of water and not wanting to spill. I wrote the appointment time on an envelope because I couldn't find paper. And when I hung up, I stared at the word effects, as if it might admit to being the wrong one. What we keep is not what we meant to keep. What is returned is never the same thing we sent out into the world. At the center, a volunteer led me to a small room with a table that could have been anyone's kitchen table, the kind where you have birthdays and arguments and learn to do fractions. A cardboard box sat in the middle like a guest. They didn't open it for me. They asked if I wanted to, and I nodded because I could not conjure a reason on earth to prolong the distance between what was and what remained. The flaps lifted, and a smell rose. Industrial cleaner chased by something less polite, the kind of burnt sweetness that clings to memory. Inside, the careful artifacts of a morning that had not expected to be a museum, A wallet in a clear bag, a key with a fluorescent supermarket tag on it, a pen that had etched Mark's name into 1,000 forms, the corner of a boarding pass. Paper, real, even now it insisted on being real. His wedding ring was there, in its own small pouch, delivered into my palm by a stranger whose eyes were kind, but determined not to cry before I did. The ring was the temperature of the room. I slid it onto my thumb because my fingers had forgotten how to hold that weight where it used to belong. There was the watch too, face clouded, band intact. People will tell you stories about stopped watches and the dignity of precision in tragedy, but time had not been poetic here. The second hand twitched when I wound it, indifferent to what it measured. I pressed it to my ear and listened to the smallest insistence. Tick, tick, a heartbeat you can carry. There was the portfolio, his old-fashioned devotion to paper rewarded with a survivor's stubbornness. The edges were singed, the top page buckled like a wave that decided to be still. The hand-drawn arrows were a kind of handwriting I would know anywhere, ink that looped and slowed over the places he wanted to explain. I traced one arrow with my finger and felt both foolish and devout. In the folder's pocket, he had tucked a sticky note to himself. Remember to ask about timing. The words made a sound in my chest that had nothing to do with lungs. A counselor sat with me while I inventoried what they had inventoried, while I signed that I had received what could be returned. I apologized when my hand shook and ruined the line of my name. She said, "No one has steady hands in this room." We stacked items back in the box as if we were packing for a trip to a gentler afternoon. The ring I kept on, the watch I set by the kitchen sink later, so that even when the house felt suspended, a small circle would keep moving. Grief made me practical. I became a person who made folders and labeled them: medical, insurance, correspondence, investigations. The word investigations felt too large to live on a manila tab, but where else could it go? I learned new calendar skills, deadlines that had to do with estates and filings, dates that hinged on relief funds and benefits. People warned me about lawyers at the periphery, and there they were indeed, not vultures exactly, but no one brings a picnic to a battlefield. I listened, nodded, took cards, made two piles, later and never. I kept telling myself that paperwork was a bridge, not a swamp. On good afternoons, it almost felt true. One morning, I was invited to a briefing. Families only, they said. The room was smaller than I expected, almost intimate, as if we had gathered for a surprise party and were waiting for the guest of honor. The investigator I liked, the one with the eyes that had collected more sorrow than any single profession should, stood at the front and talked about human factors again, not as absolution, not as accusation, but as a map. She described how construction had altered the familiar, how darkness hoards its own rules, how the controller's attention had been rationed and then misplaced, how cockpit conversation, the soft human kind that rounds off sharp edges, had climbed the walls of a rule designed to keep focus narrow when focus needs to be narrow. They spoke about the corrective measures being drafted and the ones already in place. More lighting, clearer signage. Mandatory runway verification callouts said, like a prayer everyone agrees to repeat, a stricter understanding of sterile cockpit, not to punish small talk, but to protect those 36 seconds when small talk is a thief. Policies about staffing so that a single overworked man with a stack of strips isn't the only pair of eyes in the dark. The words tasted bureaucratic, and then after a minute, moral. Systems are made of choices, and choices are made of stories that either change us or don't. In the quiet after, a widow asked the question that haunted us all. How little was the little that made all of this? The investigator closed her folder and said, it was both little and not little. One wrong turn and a culture that didn't catch it in time. The room held its breath. Culture is a soft word until you learn how hard it can be. Culture is whether you feel safe saying, wait, whether your mouth has been trained to speak before your fear has been trained to hush. Culture is whether your checklist is a list or a living thing. I found myself wanting to protect the first officer from the way we could turn him into a symbol, and at the exact same time wanting to demand that the symbol account for itself. I had never before experienced such contrary heat in one body. I began to understand that my life would require me to hold opposing truths without forcing them to become one. Mark had died because good people made a mistake inside a system that assumed goodness would be enough. It is not. It is beautiful and insufficient. We need goodness harnessed to humility and attention, stitched to procedures that admit we are distractible creatures even when we mean to be steel. At home, I took the ring from my thumb and looped it on a chain, a compromise between absence and need. I fixed a small shelf for the box with his things. Not a shrine, not a refusal to accept the present, but a place where my hands could be busy. Grief has always been a craft. You sand its edges, you oil its hinges, you learn where it sticks and where it swings. Some nights the watch by the sink sounded too loud, and I placed a dish towel over it, as if muting time could teach me to sleep. Other nights, I left our window open to the airport's distant chorus, and when a plane climbed into the dark, I counted to 36, and then kept counting, daring the numbers to run out. They didn't. It was a small victory, almost private. Friends still arrived with dinners and also with silence, which I learned to accept as a gift. One brought me a plant with a tender trunk and said, "It needs steady light." I laughed aloud at the unintended sermon, then promised to try. The plant and I began a routine: water on Wednesdays, turn the pot on Sundays. It did not fix a single thing that mattered, but it steadied my hands. I could not change headings in the air, but I could choose where to put a pot. I could not relight a center line, but I could find the sunny spot in my own small house and do right by one living thing. There were days I raged at systems, and days I raged at weather, and days I raged at the terrible discipline of physics that says speed plus distance equals consequence. There were other days when rage napped and left room for the quieter companions. Gratitude for the chaplain who knew when not to speak, for the volunteer who said my name like she was putting a warm coat over my shoulders, for the investigator who refused to trade precision for platitudes. These are also effects, I realized. What tragedy hands you that you did not ask for and which you take anyway, because refusing would be an insult to the people who carried it to your door. I thought often about the sentence, "Timing is everything," the title on Mark's slide deck. It had always been a joke that wore a business suit, a way to break the ice. Now, stripped of charm, it sounded like the simplest prayer in the world. Timing is everything at a sink when you decide whether to kiss once or twice. Timing is everything in a cockpit when somebody is brave enough to catch a small wrong before it rolls its way toward a catastrophe. Timing is everything when you choose to speak the question that may save a stranger's life. Does this look right to you? On the 30th day, I wore his watch out into the world. The sun found the glass. I met a friend for coffee. On the way home, a low thundercloud gathered and then changed its mind and drifted north. At my kitchen table, I opened the portfolio again and smoothed the buckled page under my palm. The arrow he'd drawn pointed to a word: sequence. I wrote it on a clean sheet, then underneath in my own less confident hand, "Attention is a form of love." It felt like a sentence I could carry forward, one that kept faith with the person Mark was, and the world I now owed a little more caution to. The invitation arrived on heavy paper, like a wedding without joy. Public hearing, it said, and underneath the name of the board that had become a new continent in my life, the one where causes are named and then argued into improvements. There would be rows of microphones, slides, men and women in suits with lanyards, language that dressed itself in caution and then, if we were lucky, decided to be brave. I set the letter beside Mark's watch and thought, this is what it looks like when grief puts on shoes. Washington in winter can feel like a city holding its breath. The sky presses low. The marble tries to remember it's stone and not theatre. I walked toward the building with other people who had learned to recognize each other by the way we held our shoulders. Forward a little, like a person bracing against a door that keeps blowing open. Inside, security trays received our keys, our rings, our small metal talismans. A volunteer, why are the kindest faces always volunteers, handed us agenda packets and tissues, the new communion. We took our seats, and the dais filled with people whose job is to be precise in public. I can respect that even when the words hurt. The chairwoman read a statement that began and ended where statements always begin and end, with sympathy, with the promise of learning. Then the experts began. There was a diagram on the screen, one I knew already, like the veins on my wrist. Runway 22 long and lit, runway 26 short and dark. A tangle of taxiways revised by construction that had made familiar routes unfamiliar in a way that only feels obvious later. A staffer, calm as a metronome, traced the path the CRJ should have taken and the path it actually took. He did not moralize. He did not need to. The lines themselves carried the admonition. They did not play the cockpit voice recorder audio. They never do. Instead, an investigator read portions of the transcript, his voice measured so that it wouldn't break under what it bore. Bits of conversation rose from the page. Harmless in any other morning, harmful in this one. The comfort of routine had filled spaces where attention was supposed to be sovereign. Sterile cockpit means you fence off distraction when you're busy doing dangerous, delicate things. We heard how the fence had a gate left open. We heard the clear takeoff clearance for runway 22. We heard the callouts that should have caught the wrong alignment and didn't. The room kept its sound low, like a church. I wrote the sentence, "Attention is a form of love," in the margin of my agenda because I needed a sentence that wasn't technical to live beside all the technical ones. They spoke of the lone controller. He had cleared them, then turned to a task that belonged to the same job but a different moment. Shift staffing, administrative workloads in the darkest hours, policies that trusted a single set of eyes with a field full of moving metal and fallible humans. I had wanted a villain I could point at from a safe, moral distance. Instead, I got the harder truth, a professional who had done what others do nightly, and a system that let that be enough until the morning it wasn't. My anger recalibrated itself, not softer, not kinder, but more usefully directed. Anger applied precisely can be a lever rather than a fire. On one slide, a phrase I'd met before in books but had never considered in an airplane, confirmation bias, stared back at us like a mirror. You see what you expect to see. The mind, loyal and lazy, prefers its usual path. If you think you're on 22, you make the cues you meet behave as if they are 22. The cure is structured doubt, which is really just a fancy term for humility with a checklist. Heading check, runway readback. Centerline lights, present or absent, named out loud. You make the invisible visible by saying it. 22 confirmed. The silence that follows should be an alarm. In our story, silence dressed as normalcy. Family members took turns at the microphone during a break. A mother with steady hands and a voice you wanted as your own said, "Please don't dilute this into an accident made of fog. It was made of choices we can fix." A father in a ball cap asked for an extra controller at night the way you ask for a seatbelt for a child. Not hysterical, not dramatic, just obvious once you've imagined the alternative. I held my paper cup and thought, we are amateurs at policy and professionals at loss, and maybe that combination is exactly what change sometimes needs. In the afternoon, the tone shifted from post-mortem to covenant. Recommendations, the slide announced, and I learned the bureaucracy's word for hope. Some items were already happening back in Lexington, runway signage repainted like an apology you can see from space. Centerline lighting extended, taxi diagrams updated and emphasized, tower staffing reviewed. So one person isn't the only heartbeat on duty in the hours when attention is most expensive. Others would travel farther, strengthening the language and habit of mandatory runway verification callouts, tightening sterile cockpit discipline, not as punishment for humanity, but as protection for it, refining training around scenario traps like construction detours and dawn light, culture again, the soft word that decides hard outcomes. A board member looked up from his binder and said something that has stayed with me longer than some of the facts. We don't just fix parts, we fix habits. The sentence rang like a bell. Habits are where love lives and where danger likes to hide. Habits are the extra kiss in the kitchen at 4:45 a.m. Habits are also the unsaid challenge in a cockpit when the numbers under your wheels disagree with the number in your head. Someone asked about blame. The question was careful, like stepping across a stream on stones. The answer was careful too. Accountability is not a cudgel, the investigator said. It is a tool. You use it to shape a new thing, not to make rubble of a person. I thought of the first officer and how the word survivor is too small for what he has to carry. I thought of the captain's family, who must live with a word slung too easily in casual conversation, pilot error, when what happened was a system that made error more likely and a morning that turned ordinary lapses lethal. On the second day, they invited us to a smaller room where we could ask questions that love had smuggled into legal language. Why no stop bar lights at the runway entrance? How are construction NOTAMs forced into the bloodstream of practice rather than left, as paperwork vitamins pilots are expected to swallow without water? Could runway numbers be lit differently, brighter at dawn, bossier in the dark? I asked the only question I knew how to ask. How do you teach people to be brave enough to say, this doesn't look right, when everyone is tired and on time is a religion? The woman with the careful eyes said, you reward the question so often that silence begins to feel unsafe. I wrote that down too. On the flight home, I sat by the window for the first time since August. The sun had the sly angle of late afternoon and made a mirror of the wing. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm, a little amused in the way some pilots are when they are shepherding a sky full of strangers. And he said, runway 28 right, cleared for takeoff. I watched the numbers slide under us. 28R, plain as a billboard. The centerline lights marched forward in perfect discipline. I found myself whispering the heading like a person saying grace. When the wheels lifted, my stomach did its old startled drop and then, astonishingly, steadied. I cried, quietly, into the scratchy airline napkin, not because the fear was gone, but because the world had allowed me an inch of heaven above the ground that had taken everything. At home that night, I put the hearing agenda on the shelf beside Mark's ring and the portfolio. It looked out of place and exactly right. This is what it means, I thought, for our private story to become public safety. I watered the plant. I reset his watch. I slept badly, and then a little better. The next morning I wrote a letter to the board. My first letter to a government body in my life. I thanked them for the precision and told them what precision feels like from the kitchen table where a ring lives on a chain. I asked them to be stubborn, to keep the recommendations from dissolving into the next crisis. I mailed it with a stamp that showed a lighthouse because I am not above symbols. In the weeks that followed, small signs of change appeared like shy birds. A news story about brighter runway numbers. A friend who flies for a regional sending me a photo of a placard now required to be read aloud. Runway verification complete. Another friend texting from a red eye to say the second set of eyes in the tower just caught a runway crossing that didn't belong. I am not naive. Not every recommendation becomes law. Not every law becomes habit. But some do. Some travel from room to runway, from sentence to muscle memory. I used to think closure was the prize you get if you sit through enough hearings and collect enough facts. I don't think that anymore. Closure is a door that swings a little on its hinges but never fully clicks. What I want isn't closure anyway. What I want is consequences that honor love. If the cost of our loss is a safer dawn for strangers, then I can live beside that equation, even if I will never call it fair. That evening, a storm moved over our neighborhood, loud and theatrical. The dog leaned into my leg, unconvinced by my confidence. I stood at the window and counted between lightning and thunder, measuring distance like a child. When the sky finally tired itself out, the street smelled new. Somewhere, a jet eased into the darkness on the right runway, the right heading, the culture in its cockpit tuned to doubt and to the courage of small questions. I whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular and everyone at once. The email said there would be a small gathering out near the perimeter road for anyone who wants a quieter way to remember. No podium, no press, just a fence line, a field, and the runway in the middle distance, like a sentence you've read so many times you know where the commas are. I read the message 3 times, then forwarded it to Mark's sister with only 2 words. "You coming?" She wrote back 10 minutes later. "Yes, I'll drive." We went on a Saturday that pretended to be spring, the kind of Kentucky day that makes promises it can't keep. The wind had teeth, but the light was generous. The airport sat in its usual patience, concrete and grass coexisting like old neighbors who don't have to talk to understand each other. We parked alongside a handful of cars by a chain-link fence that had gathered its own congregation over the months. Ribbons bleached to soft pastels, laminated photos weather-curled at the corners, a child's plastic airplane clipped to the metal with a clothespin. I reached into my coat pocket and found the sticky note from Mark's portfolio, the copy I carry, not the original, and ran my thumb over the words. "Remember to ask about timing." The ink had begun to fuzz from being touched, the way a prayer wears down into a smoother shape. A volunteer I recognized from the early days greeted us. She had switched out the laminated badge for a wool scarf, but her face kept the same calm. "We'll just be here," she said, as if we might suspect the event of turning into something demanding. A few families clustered in little islands, drifting toward one another and then away, the tide of living and not knowing what to say. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee and the good paper cups, the kind with sleeves. A man I didn't know much beyond his first name handed me one and said, "For your hands." I took it, grateful for a sentence that didn't try to do anything more than warm me. From this angle, the runway numbers were white and stern against the asphalt, too far to touch and too close to ignore. Planes taxied in their own choreography, slow and deliberate, and every time a nose turned toward the threshold, I felt my body lean forward the way you do when you watch a child learn to ride a bike. Somewhere beyond our sightline, a controller's voice did its quiet work. I imagined another controller now, not alone, or if alone, then supported by a system that no longer pretended solitude could be a standard operating condition. I didn't need to see the tower to believe in what I hoped had changed inside it. We walked the fence line like people browsing a library. There were names in Sharpie thick as rope, dates written in a schoolchild's careful numerals, a blue ribbon with silver ink that read, "Fly high, Dad." I thought of all the hands that had tied these knots. You can read grief in handwriting as easily as in a face. Mark's sister paused at a photo of a woman about our age, grinning at the camera from the deck of a boat. "She looks like she'd be loud in a good way," Sarah said. I nodded. In the first weeks, I had thought only in singulars, my loss, my man. Now the plurality had settled in. 49 lives is not a crowd. It is 49 universes, each with their own weather, their own kitchen sinks, their own lists tacked to the refrigerator with a magnet from a beach they loved. At the end of the fence, a firefighter stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, the posture of someone who isn't sure he has the right to be there, and also knows he does. He had the look I'd seen on responders before, a gaze that takes in exits and edges, even when the room is only a field. He introduced himself, and then, with that careful economy, people who have seen too much learn to use, said, I was there that morning. The sentence hung between us like a bridge we had to decide whether to cross. He didn't tell a war story. He told a weather report, dark, but the kind that starts to argue with itself. He said, wet in the air. The smell of cut grass from the maintenance we'd done the day before. Sirens that didn't sound like TV because they never do in person. He described the way they trained afterward, how they changed a few priorities, how they argued for equipment and got some of it. He didn't say hero, he didn't say failure. He said, we learned. I wanted to hug him, and I wanted to make a law out of that sentence. Instead, I handed him my coffee cup because my hands had finally warmed and his were still in his pockets. He took it with a half smile and said, thanks. You folks keep teaching us too. I didn't ask him about the last minute. I have learned which questions have answers I am not built to carry. Instead, I asked him about the first minutes, the way feet find ground when ground has just misbehaved. He talked about muscle memory, how training is a way to give your future self the mercy of not having to invent heroism in real time. Checklists, he said, and I almost laughed because the word had threaded itself through every room of my life now. He meant triage and hoses and coordination. I heard headings and sterile cockpit and centerline lights, and also grocery lists and turning the plant twice a week and making sure the dog's leash hangs by the door where hands expect to find it. A culture of attention is not only for airplanes. Sarah and I walked out to where the grass rose in a little berm. Beyond it, the field kept its secrets like fields do. We stood in the wind and let the silence be exactly as long as we could stand it. Do you think about meeting him? She asked, meaning the survivor. Sometimes, I said. Sometimes I write him letters in my head. Sometimes I write the controller too. Sometimes I write to no one and it still feels like a conversation. Sarah nodded. What do the letters say? I searched for the truth that didn't make me sound like a saint or a monster. They say, I hate this. They say, I'm trying to be bigger than my anger. They say, please help make sure the next person is a stranger I never have to meet because nothing went wrong. On our way back to the car, we passed a little boy pressing his face to the fence, the metal imprinting a temporary grid on his cheek. His mother said, what do you see? And he said, numbers, with the zeal of a new reader. Good, she replied. Remember them. I wanted to kneel beside him and give him the whole sermon, that numbers can save your life and break your heart, that one wrong number painted large on the ground can echo through 1,000 kitchens, that the smallest habit, saying the number out loud, checking it against a compass, letting your doubt breathe, can be a kind of love you offer people you'll never know. But you can't hand a child a burden and call it a lesson. So I smiled at him instead and counted to 22 under my breath. We drove without music. The city eased around us, and the airport receded in the rear view until it was only a stack of lights in a flat sky. At a red light, Sarah reached over and rested her hand on my wrist. When you're ready, she said, we can clear out his workbench. The workbench, a nation condensed to 4 feet of wood. Jars of screws sorted by a logic Mark never wrote down, a tangle of cords that belonged to devices we probably no longer own, a level with a bubble that always found the truth. Not yet, I said, but soon. I have learned to trust words like soon. They have the humility of a promise, made without a timetable. That night, I took the ring from its chain and set it on the kitchen table beside the portfolio. I opened to the buckled page and drew a small box where his arrow pointed to sequence. Inside the box I wrote fence, field, runway, sky. It felt like a map, and like most maps it ignored the terrain of feeling, but it still helped. I whispered the order to myself the way children whisper the alphabet in a test. I am building my own checklist now, so ordinary they would bore anyone else. Lock the door. Blow out the candle, say the number, ask the question, Buckle the seatbelt and the other one too, the one in your mind that keeps you from assuming you're always on the right path. Later, under the good lamp, I tried to read and failed, tried to sleep and failed, tried to be reasonable and failed. So I wrote one of the letters I never send. It was to the first officer this time, though I didn't put his name. I hope you learn to breathe again, I wrote. I hope you have someone who sits with you when the night reruns itself. I hope your work, whatever shape it takes now, makes the world less likely to swallow strangers. I don't know what forgiveness is supposed to look like from your side. From mine, it looks like an agreement to keep asking small, brave questions. I am trying. I folded the letter and tucked it into the portfolio pocket where Mark used to hide receipts he swore he'd organize later. It felt right, them being neighbors. A storm prowled the county line close to midnight, the kind with long grumbles that sound like a train changing its mind. I stood at the window with the plant and pinched off one leaf that had gone yellow. The dog snored. A plane crossed the bruised sky, its lights honest as a metronome. I counted 1, 2, 3, and when I reached 36, I didn't stop. I kept going until I ran out of numbers I could count without losing track and had to start over. I do this sometimes, not out of superstition, but out of defiance. Time is the only thing I can stretch without asking permission. In the morning, I set the ring back on its chain and put on Mark's watch. At the sink, the faucet sputtered before surrendering to a clean stream, the house remembering its lines. I kissed my fingers and touched the face of the watch, a superstition I have adopted without apology. And then I practiced the habit I want to teach anyone who will listen. I said out loud to an empty kitchen, "Check the heading." The words sounded less like grief today and more like love. I woke before the alarm and stood at the window, the plant making its small shadow on the sill. Out past the roofs, a jet lifted into a clean, ordinary sky. For a long time I believed ordinary had betrayed me. Now I'm learning that ordinary is how love keeps living when the extraordinary breaks. Today I decided to visit the fence again. Alone this time, because endings, when we're lucky, come quietly and ask for privacy. The field wore yesterday's wind. I walked the perimeter road with my hands in my pockets, not to look brave, but to keep from doing the frantic things hands do when they're searching for a handle on the air. The ribbons on the chain link moved like they were agreeing with one another. The photos had paled, but the smiles inside them refused to be taught a lesson. I slid Mark's ring from its chain, pressed the cool circle to the fence, and counted to 36 with the patient stubbornness of someone who will never let those seconds loose without a witness. A maintenance truck rattled past on the service road, the driver raising 2 fingers in a salute that was half greeting, half benediction. Far off, a regional jet paused at the hold short line, the way a careful person stands at a doorway and listens before entering a loud room. I could not hear the cockpit, but I heard it anyway, numbers said out loud, headings named like small, reliable gods. The quiet courage of one voice asking the other to look again. A runway number flashed white in the sun. I mouthed it, and then its opposite, a private superstition that feels less like magic than like practice. Grief isn't a mountain. It's a district you learn how to live in. You figure out which streets flood and which cafe will refill your cup, no questions asked. You find the park bench where the morning light is gentle enough to tell the truth without scaring you. You learn to carry the address of a friend who will open the door even when you arrive empty-handed and loud with weather. In my district, there's a workbench in the garage I still can't touch, and a portfolio on the kitchen table I touch too often. There are checklists that keep me honest, and sentences that keep me human. Attention is a form of love. Check the heading. I used to think forgiveness would feel like a verdict. It doesn't. It feels like maintenance, small, repetitive tasks that keep a system from failing. When I picture the first officer now, I don't place him in the burning minutes. I place him in a room with a window, learning how to breathe again, making his own checklists, choosing over and over to help build the world that could have saved us. When I picture the controller, I don't leave him alone in that tower. I put a second chair there and a second set of eyes and a culture that refuses the fantasy of heroic solitude. When I picture the captain, I remember the 100 safe mornings that taught him a habit no one should have to unlearn in the dark, and I ask that our stubborn attention could be the apology he never got to hear. I took the ring back into my palm and closed my fingers around it. We did the best we could, people say, when the story hurts too much to tell straight. What I want now is a better sentence. We will do better because we remember. Memory is not a shrine, it's a workshop. It sands the rough edges off our excuses and makes the tools sharper. It turns a number on the ground into a promise in the mouth. It keeps a stranger safe because someone somewhere once refused to let a single morning vanish without leaving behind a rule you can use. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store. I bought clear jars with clean lids and a label maker that clicks like a tiny typewriter. Back in the garage, I stood at the workbench and took a breath deep enough to annoy my ribs. Then I began. Wood screws, machine screws, anchors, each in its jar, each with a name. I set the level on the back edge where it wouldn't fall, and I wiped the surface with a rag Mark would have criticized for being too clean. When I finished, the bench looked like a sentence that finally found its period. I brewed coffee and let it sit by the window, hot this time. The sink sputtered and then behaved. On the table, the portfolio waited. I opened to the buckled page, not because the damage still needed studying, but because the handwriting still needed loving. I wrote one more note below his arrow. Not a thesis, not a moral, just a line I can keep saying to the morning we deserved and the morning we got. Sequence, see, say, save. Outside, another jet climbed, unremarkable to everyone but me. I touched the face of Mark's watch and felt the second hand moving, indifferent and faithful at once. I won't call this closure. Doors don't seal like that in real houses. I'll call it a good latch and a promise to keep oiling the hinges. The fence, the field, the runway, the sky, the order holds. The culture we're building is not a monument, it's a habit. And in my small kitchen with a ring warming in my palm, I choose it again.